Welcome to the Carly Collection Management Committee Weeding webinar series. This third webinar will focus on reevaluating library materials. First, Matt Gorzalski, who is the University Archivist at Southern Illinois University Carbondale, will discuss weeding special collections and the need for reappraisal and deaccessioning. Following Matt's presentation, we will hear about two different institutions' experiences downsizing and moving their respective reference collections. First, we'll hear from David Bodorf, Head of Collection Management at Regenstein Library at the University of Chicago. Then we'll hear from Bill McHugh, who's the Principal Bibliographer, Coordinator for General and Interdisciplinary Services and Reference Collection Management Librarian, and Jeffrey Morse, who's the Coordinator for Humanities and Social Sciences, both at Northwestern University. I'm now going to turn the mic over to Matt so he can discuss weeding the special collections at SIU.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'll be talking about weeding special collections as well as reappraisal and deaccessioning. Now, my presentation will not focus on a specific weeding or reappraisal project, but I will be using examples from my experience throughout the presentation. And I feel like I need to talk about reappraisal and deaccessioning in addition to weeding because I feel that's probably more akin to library weeding, as hopefully my presentation will reveal. My background is in university archives, but everything I have to say can apply to manuscripts and personal papers as well. So in special collections, weeding is simply the process of identifying and removing materials from a larger body of records. And I have to emphasize that we are talking about item level individual records being removed from a individual collection. It's not for larger bodies of materials. It's a pretty routine process, as we'll get into later. And as far as collection management is concerned, then it really doesn't have a whole lot of impact as far as space saving or other things you would think about with collection management. But that's why we'll get into reappraisal and deaccessioning later. So there are several terms for discarding materials in the special collection environment, and I just categorize some because sometimes I see these used interchangeably. And just to emphasize again that weeding is, in the strictest sense, the item level. And as you can see, when you're talking about removing an entire collection or a series within a collection, that's where reappraisal and deaccessioning come into play. And this distinction is important because the act of weeding in a special collections or archival environment is a part of processing and not appraisal. The appraisal is where you are assessing the archival value of a collection for long-term retention or permanent retention, and weeding is a part of the processing of that collection. So that's the arrangement and the description of the collection. So you've already made those important retention decisions in the appraisal process, and weeding is just polishing up the collection, getting it ready for research. And this therefore makes weeding a fairly routine process with not a whole lot to consider as you're doing it. We weed because it saves a little bit of space and resources, fewer boxes and folders to house records, maybe cuts down on the shelf space that a collection will consume. So there's the space saving and resource saving aspects of it. I think it's more valuable, though, to improve access to materials and reduce liabilities. It improves access to materials simply in the fact that a researcher has less paper to dig through, and we're talking about superfluous papers that do not have archival retention value that are still in the collection. So it saves them, the energy of looking through all that extra material, and you can reduce legal liabilities, which I'll get into in a couple of slides about removing sensitive material from a collection. So here are the characteristics of weeded records. Oftentimes they are routine, transactional, and ephemeral paperwork. They're papers that do not merit permanent retention or have really no value beyond the event that created them. And we're talking about things like invoices and vouchers, those types of payment records, that type of material. The records we weed are oftentimes also readily available elsewhere, things like publications. I've weeded several publications from faculty collections that are really their personal libraries that are better suited for library stacks rather than an archival collection because they're not unique. They're mass-produced and available in other places. Duplicative materials, things that have one or two or multiple copies. You don't need to keep multiple copies of the same photographs or papers. So we just keep one or two and weed or remove the rest of them. And records with no information. We're just talking about blank forms, letterheads with nothing written on it, or envelopes, things like that that have no informational value for a researcher. This is a long list from Northern Michigan University to give you an idea of the types of records that we remove. And it's fairly easy to identify and spot records to weed from a collection that have limited to no informational, evidential, or archival value. It's a long list. I won't go, just so you can glance over it, I won't go into explaining, each record format, but that gives you an idea of the type of material that we're talking about when it comes to weeding. And now this is where weeding is probably where you do have to really think about what you're doing a little bit more. Removing potentially sensitive materials from personal papers or faculty papers that have this type of information. I have weeded quite a few bank records or IRA retirement papers that have Social Security numbers and sensitive account information from faculty collections. Now these people are deceased, so that stuff isn't relevant anymore, at least from our end of things. So you reduce the liability for privacy or any kind of legal trouble that you can get in. Student-related records, you'll often find those in faculty papers, and because of FERPA restrictions, I weed those out. And we're talking about things like student advisement paperwork or graded assignments, anything with grades on them. And I feel comfortable weeding those from faculty collections because those aren't really the record copy. Our registrar's office keeps the record copy on student academic performance. So the faculty materials, I feel we can weed comfortably. Health records I haven't come across too many of in my papers, but those are things that you would also want to probably remove if they're not the record copy and available elsewhere. And then records of a very personal nature. I have removed a couple boxes recently from a faculty collection that we got about the person's lengthy divorce. A lot of those types of materials. Now this collection was very large. It did an excellent job of documenting her service here at SIU and her involvement in national organizations. We had a bulk of material and we really didn't need to know about her divorce. So that was another candidate for weeding. So that really covers weeding. It's a routine process to tidy up a collection that's already been appraised and to make it easier for researchers to use and also to reduce legal liabilities. So that's it for weeding in special collections. Now we'll get on to reappraisal and deaccessioning, where this is where a lot of more heavy considerations go into play. When you're talking about removing an entire collection or a large series within a collection, That is the act of reappraisal and deaccessioning. The process of identifying materials that no longer merit preservation or are candidates for deaccessioning. And deaccessioning is the process by which you remove them from your collection, from your repository holdings. And this is what I think is more akin to library weeding. Correct me if I'm wrong. I may be wrong, but this is clearly the more powerful collection management tool. Reappraisal and deaccessioning, there are a lot of purposes why you would want to do it. You would want to reappraise your holdings to comply with your current mission statement. Now, once upon a time, mission statements were not necessarily commonplace in archives, and they are really meant to focus your collecting efforts topically or geographically, or usually some blend of the two. So if you have collections on your shelves that don't fit with that collecting policy, that mission statement, then they are candidates to remove from your collection. And this then improves the access to your materials, in that when you remove a collection, it's best practice to always look to see if it can be better housed somewhere else. So if I had a collection from somebody, a family from Massachusetts, that I thought was merited archival retention, then I would contact an archive in Massachusetts and see if they were interested in taking this. So it puts the collection in the context better of which it was created, in the environment. So that's how it can improve access to collections. A reappraisal corrects faulty appraisal decisions, initial appraisal decisions. Archival appraisal theory really developed. It'd been around since the 1950s with Schellenberg's evidential and informational value, but it really matured in the 1980s with macro appraisal techniques. So, and mission statements, again, were not as popular in those days. So you may have collections that don't make sense for your holdings or don't complement your other holdings. Making split collections whole. Sometimes you'll have a collection where papers of one person are housed in different repositories, and we have that at SIU. Catherine Dunham's papers, for example, we have a lot here. There are some in St. Louis, or East St. Louis, and others in a repository on the East Coast, which is escaping me at the moment. But that is, if you're compelled to make a collection whole, you can deaccession and send it to the most appropriate repository to bring a collection together, and assess and prioritize backlogs. Reappraisal is good for if you have a backlog of archival collections that are not processed and unavailable for research, then you can assess those, look for things that you may want to remove from your collection to lighten your backlog load. And then Replevin with Native American materials. I don't have any experience with that, but this list comes from the Society of American Archivists Guide for Reappraisal and Deaccessioning. And so some institutions have to deal with Replevin deaccessioning those back to their appropriate tribes. And of course, then with the allocation of resources, you can make sure you're devoting the resources to collections that are most appropriate to be processing and not wasting resources on things that are not really appropriate for your repository. This is a list of considerations for reappraisal and deaccessioning. Before you remove materials from your collection, you have to determine whether or not you have the legal ownership. Do you have the ownership and the authority to dispose of a collection? If you do not, or you can't determine that, then look at your state's abandoned property laws and see if the collection's been sitting in your repository for long enough. Do abandoned property laws apply? If you're a government or an institutional archive, you probably have a retention schedule that governs the disposition of record series that would spell out legally how you can handle or manage getting rid of certain materials. And for manuscripts and personal papers and faculty papers, you want to look at your deed of gift forms, make sure you have a deed of gift form that proves your ownership, and look at the donor correspondence. And it's very important to make sure that your deed of gift form has language in it that allows you to get rid of materials if they do get reappraised or even weeded. And it's best practice to then offer those materials back to the donor and rather than just tossing them. And if the donor doesn't want them, then look for a more appropriate repository. And if nobody's interested, then go ahead and dispose of them. There are ethical considerations that you want to make sure that your aim is ethical when removing collections. You don't want to let personal bias or resource allocator pressures be a factor in what you keep and what you don't keep. And always consider, would this collection be housed in a better repository rather than going into the recycle bin? Donor relations are another area. This can be touchy. Donors might be offended that you don't want their materials anymore. Well, there is research out there in archival journals that shows that donors by and large had no real qualm mostly about getting rid of their materials. But you want to be open and transparent about the reappraisal process. Again, the mission statement I've covered before. Make sure the collections fit in your mission statement. Major restrictions. If there are major restrictions in place and the collection that inhibits access significantly, then that's a candidate for deaccessioning and reappraisal. The condition and the collection formats are. Now, I recently deaccessioned a faculty collection that were 1970s computer punch cards used for a book that was published, and we have the book in the stacks. The collection is inaccessible in this punch card format because nobody has those computers anymore, so that was a candidate that I deaccessioned. Use statistics is touchy. You don't want to deaccession something simply because it's not used, but it needs to go into consideration. And then you would reevaluate your records using the standard appraisal techniques, which are very broad and in-depth, like functional analysis and evidential and informational value. Here's a list of characteristics of deaccessioned records. For time's sake, I'll just highlight a couple of them with some examples that I've done. For not fitting the current collection policy, I've deaccessioned several faculty personal libraries. We never had a collection policy for faculty papers until I wrote one, coming here about 2 years ago. And we're talking about the publications that they collected over the course of their career that belong in a library stack rather than being unique archival material in special collections. Faculty publication series. We have about 35 to 40 cubic feet. Now this is on my list. I haven't gotten to it yet. Of publications written by university faculty. And we're talking about photocopied journal articles organized alphabetically by author. And if those came with a faculty collection, that would be great. But standalone, these piecemeal articles really have no value for us. Plus, they're already published in journals elsewhere. Materials that are not unique or archival or transactional with no long-term value, I've deaccessioned quite a few of those. For example, when I was working in Kansas, we had several boxes of unopened scratch-off lottery games from the Kansas State Lottery that we reappraised and decided to deaccession. Also, with the Office of Sponsored Projects here on campus, I removed dozens and dozens of boxes of invoices and receipts and payment records that were very old and had no informational value beyond that time. Let's see. Records that are unprocessed or in an off-site storage for a very long time. We had a set of theater set designs, watercolor illustrations that sat in an offsite storage for a very long time that I deaccessioned last November. Now, we have this type of record in our archives from our theater faculty, but these were different. There was a contest in the late 60s from students all over the country, so these were student designs, not professional. These never made it to the stage. They were mostly not SIU students, and they sat in the storage for forever. So that was a candidate, again, that I deaccessioned and got rid of. And formats that are inaccessible because of technology. I mentioned the faculty punch cards, and also collection condition. I had a set of photograph negatives that had disintegrated beyond any recognition, so I got rid of those as well. Those are a few examples from me. Wrapping things up to how do you discard collections? Again, return the items to the donors if they don't want them. Or if you don't want them, that's best practice, and make sure your deed of gift allows for that. Recycle things or shred, depending on if it's sensitive, and that's shredding if mostly in a university setting where you could have sensitive material like social security numbers, and if the retention schedule says dispose of it, then you can go ahead and do so. And the last thing is the sale of items. Now, I've never done that. That's just something from the SAA guide on reappraisals. So that is another option, just to throw that out there. That wraps up my presentation on weeding and reappraisal and deaccessioning in special collections. And the next presenter is David from the University of Chicago. So I will mute my microphone and
thank you, Matt. I think my slides are coming up now. So I'll be talking about something rather different than Matt. I will be speaking about a specific case at the Joseph Regenstein Library here at the University of Chicago, where we underwent a rather large, complex weeding project to consolidate and reduce our reference collections. And I'll just say a caveat about weeding. In this context, weeding means moving out of the reference collections and into the circulating collections rather than actual deaccessioning. And I'm going to be talking less about the philosophy behind it, although I'm happy to answer questions about that at the end, and more about the process itself. So first of all, let me give you just a little bit of background. Joseph Regenstein Library has a capacity of around 5 million volumes, and as a result of the opening in May of 2011 of our newest library, the Joe Enrique Mansueto Library, we were finally able to move several 100,000 volumes out of Regenstein because it was well beyond its capacity, and that meant that we needed to reorganize and move essentially every book in the building. And so as part of that larger project, we took the opportunity to reassess and reorganize our reference collections, in part because we finally had space in the circulating collections to place materials that were out of date or little used from the reference collections. And that reorganization project as a whole lasted a little over a year. It ran from 2011 to 2012. It was about a 14-month project. It went very well, I will say, much like a Swiss watch. It did feel occasionally more like this, for me at least, being the main point person on a day-to-day basis. But in order to accomplish all of this, we obviously relied heavily. We did a lot of assessment. We asked, we did surveys of faculty and students. We did wayfinding studies. One of the big things that we took away from that with our reference collections were that they were simply too complicated to use. We had many separate reference collections. They were separated largely by discipline. They were on multiple floors, sometimes on the same floor, but in separate call number runs. which made it extremely difficult for users to find materials that they needed. And so we knew what we wanted was a general consolidated reference collection, something that would be simpler, something that would be up-to-date and easier to use. So we identified 7 reference collections across our 5 reading room floors, and our goal was to consolidate those down to 2. A general reference collection and a very small reference desk collection on the first floor next to our main reference desk. And as part of that project, we also needed to reduce the overall size of our reference collections, and our target was really to identify approximately 50,000 volumes and move those out of the reference collections and into the circulating collections, either in the OpenStax or in the new high-density storage of Mansueto. So obviously, such a large and complicated weeding project presented a series of challenges. First of all, because these reference collections had been separated by discipline over the years historically, decisions needed to be made collaboratively. We had a lot of different library staff, librarians who needed to consult on those decisions, and we were really relying, there was a range of criteria across the collections moving into this general reference collection that differed very much based on what material it was and what was felt was needed in a reference collection. We did not establish a formal set of rules or rubrics for these selections. Rather, we established some best practices and then left it up to the librarians to make those final decisions. Another important aspect of this is that we needed to make those decisions over a year before the actual move, and that was for 2 reasons. One, because the librarians felt that they really only had time to do this over a summer, so it was in the summer of 2010 that this work was done, but also we needed to provide volume counts for the RFP that we issued to the various library moving companies who we were asking to do this larger move. This was all one project to move everything in the building, both reference collections and the Bookstacks materials. And so we really needed very granular, detailed information about where everything was going, how many volumes, some estimate of how many linear inches might be involved. We also had limited staff, particularly from a technical services point of view, in terms of updating the records of anything that was moving. We really weren't going to be able to push, all of these books past someone's desk to have them updated in our ILS. And most importantly, we wanted to continue to serve our users. We didn't want to leave anybody sitting out on the steps unable to use our books. They needed to be discoverable, most importantly, and accessible at all times. So with all those challenges, how did we accomplish this weeding project? So first of all, we initially went down the road of simply having the librarians work off of shelf lists generated from our ILS. It turned out, although that was somewhat valuable, we didn't have a lot of information about how often something had been used. We hadn't historically been capturing in-house use for the reference collections. And more importantly, the librarians felt that really without having the book in hand at the shelf, being able to see exactly what it was, the lists weren't doing them as much good as they could have. So we really, what we took was in some ways a very old-fashioned approach. Each librarian was allowed to look at their sort of section of material and flag books with colored streamers, coded to a particular decision. That also allowed that collaboration to take place, because our librarians could then see each other's decisions, ask each other about them, negotiate back and forth to make changes. That is all very sort of straightforward and in some ways traditional approach, but because the move wasn't happening for a year, and because we knew those slips weren't going to stay in place, but also for a number of other reasons that I'll talk about, we needed to capture that data. We needed to know what those decisions were. So the way that we did that was relatively straightforward. We scanned everything. We sent student workers with handheld barcode scanners out to the stacks of the reference collections, and they scanned in waves, generating text files with, every single book that had been selected for the general reference collection, scanning it. Every single book that had been selected for integration into the circulating collection, scanning that into a separate file. And then I uploaded those files into a Microsoft Access database, and having that database allowed us to do a number of different things. First of all, of course, it did allow us to provide movers with the lists that they needed. Those lists could be analyzed at the call number level, so you could say there are 758 PNs moving into the stacks. There will be a total of, making numbers up here, 1,500 BLs in the general reference collection. And it also allowed us to do quality control. It also allowed us actually to update records in batch, getting back to that staffing issue, so that for those 50,000 books that were moving into the circulating collections, they couldn't move in immediately. They had to be integrated over the course of about the 9 months that it took to rearrange our Bookstacks collections. So once those were identified, they were moved first thing down to a swing space in our one of our basement levels, and updated as a batch based on the lists that we had in our database to show their location and show their availability. Also, having all of these decisions captured in a database allowed us to do a lot of quality control. We were able to generate lists that the librarians could review after all of this collaborative work had been done to see where they had actually said that they wanted things to go, and they could make changes. And it also allowed us to identify titles for which no decision had been captured, and allowed us to go back and ask, what do we do with this particular title? Where would you like this to go? So the final aspect of our quality control was sort of twofold. One, for the general reference collection itself, and for that reference desk collection, once the movers had taken the lists of here's everything that we want you to move into this particular area, into this particular collection, we then went back and again scanned in place with student workers and handheld barcode scanners every single book in that collection, and that allowed us to capture anything that had gotten in there that shouldn't have, or anything that was missing, and ultimately allowed us to make sure that what was there and in place was its location was reflected in our catalog into our ILS. And then somewhat unique which also of course proved to be helpful in terms of making sure that the collections remained discoverable and accessible. And then for the 50,000 volumes that we had weeded out of the reference collections and were together in a single A to Z sequence on our basement level, this is not a picture actually from us, this is just a Flickr photo that I stole because I didn't think to take any photos of this entire year-long project because I was too busy actually involved in it, and now I deeply regret not having photographic proof of everything that we did. But very similar wooden carts to these were essentially processed by student staff in small batches, one at a time, as that particular call number range was ready to be integrated into our book stacks. So again, we scanned all of those things into our ILSs. We use Horizon here currently into the item group editor, updated all of those item records to their new location so that they would spend the least amount of time with people not knowing where they were. They would essentially say, we're in this swing space collection right up until the moment that they were integrated, at which point then and only then would they say that they were part of the book stacks. And so that was done in small batches over the course of 9 months, and that was a critical component to this project in terms of making the books available to our users. And it's really a workflow that we could only accomplish because we had already developed this workflow for capturing the decisions in the year and a half before this. That sort of proved to us that this was a model that we could adopt, relying on student employees, relying on scanning each individual barcode to capture these things. It was something that we could absorb. So after all this was said and done and the dust settled, it's been a couple of years now, looking back, what are the things that we learned from this that might be useful to others who are planning similar weeding projects? First and most importantly, it's very important to build in flexibility and be willing to work with the people who are actually going to be making these decisions. One size really doesn't fit all. There's a tendency, I believe here, to assume that with something of this scale, it has to be done in sort of automated or broad ways. We were really able to accomplish something that was a much more close look on the part of various library staff, but still take advantage of technology in order to make that work. And that's the other real lesson here, is that especially at something like this scale, you have to find ways to leverage technology. It doesn't have to be anything particularly complicated or exciting. Handheld barcode scanners and capturing text files and uploading them into a database it is nothing particularly complicated or cutting edge, but it made a massive difference to the success of our project. And finally, and this is sort of more generic in some ways, but you need to plan for change. Decisions were reconsidered over the course of the project. In one case, our reference S collection had to be reduced a second time by about 2/3 because we were renovating the floor that it was located on, and the number of shelves on that floor dropped by 2/3, and so we suddenly had to go back and make those decisions again. And again, because we had this workflow in place, because we had this database that had captured all of our decisions, making those kinds of changes was easier for us, and it was easier for us to track and tell what decision was the most up-to-date and what should actually happen to each particular piece. But ultimately also prepare for mistakes. Mistakes will happen. I can list any number of different minor mistakes that happened over the course of this project. But for the most part, the important lesson here is to build in quality control and in an ongoing way, but also to plan and budget for cleanup. After all of this happened, we did, and we knew that we would, need to go back through and look at all of these collections and see, did everything sort of essentially get where it needed to go? Are there inconsistencies across the item records where, say, part of a title was in one place and part of the title was in another place? That was the most common mistake that occurred. And we planned for that, and we budgeted that into the process because we knew that anything at this scale was going to have to be done relatively quickly, and it would have to account for the fact that there would be some degree of mistakes that would creep into the system. So finally, I just want to say that scale matters. These kinds of approaches obviously apply most critically to large, particularly very complicated projects like the one that we undertook, but scale is also something that can allow you to develop techniques that you can apply to smaller scale moves, smaller weeding projects, other things. These same techniques are perfectly applicable on a smaller level, and they can still be better, more efficient, allow for fewer mistakes, even when you're dealing at a smaller scale. So I think that's the final thought that I will leave you with, and I'm happy to answer any questions in particular about the move at the end of the presentation. In the meantime, I will turn over the microphone. There's my contact information for those of you who would like it. You can also contact me after this anytime, just by email. And in the meantime, I will turn my microphone over to Bill McHugh and Jeff Morse from Northwestern University Library, and they will have a chance to talk about their weeding project with their reference collection.
Hello, this is Bill. Can you hear me?
Sounds good, Bill.
Okay. We're going to talk again somewhat procedurally about the weeding of our main reference collection. Actually, we don't have a series of slides on lessons learned, but David handled that so well, and I think all of the principles that he talked about are reflected in our work, which had a which was a little different in terms of context, actually a fairly different kind of reference collection. But it also had to be reduced very significantly, and we also were talking really, for the most part, about relocating material. We have withdrawn a few things that were duplicated, but it mainly was relocation. So Northwestern historically had a very different kind of reference collection setup. Rather than a series of smaller reference collections, we were very, very centralized. The building was designed. It's a very strange building with towers and from the first floor, where historically the reference department, the catalog department, the interlibrary loan, the bibliographers all had their offices. It was a long way to get to the stacks. So it was designed with a very centralized reference collection, a big behemoth of a reference collection that was, despite a couple significant moves out and individual volumes being moved out over the years, was about 53,000 volumes in 2012. And of course, this material, much of the print material is in decline, but there had been limited space in our main stacks to move much of the material. We did a couple years ago open a big storage facility in up in Waukegan, which is helping to start move materials out, but there was just a lot of different prioritization of materials that had to be moved out, and the print reference collection, much of it was not. Some of it was appropriate for Oak Grove, but for our remote site. But I'll get to that when we talk a little bit more about the actual process. But the point is, there really wasn't much place to move this space. However, we were doing a major reconfiguration of the first floor to create more user space, as many libraries have been doing. So we needed to reduce this collection, and our initial goal was between 10 and 15,000 volumes, so significant reductions. The reference department, which had, until our reorganization a year and a half ago, had jurisdiction over the collection, held a series of discussions to try to generate some principles for what a print reference collection would look like in of the size and within the context that we find ourselves in. What was used, what was important to keep in this collection. We developed a set of principles. It's a fairly long document. I'd be happy to share it with anyone who wants to see it. Essentially, trying to get the material there that really needed to be there. It was going to be used with some reasonable frequency for quick consultation. And then the principals went over and addressed various reference types, because most reference books fits into one of a number of categories, and each of these categories are probably demanded somewhat different treatments. Probably many fewer bibliographies needed to be kept than we had historically, but maybe encyclopedias that weren't available electronically, different kinds of criteria needed to be applied. We took a sample of the reference collection. It was a little over 1,000 volumes through, I think it was something like the 5th book in every 5th shelf. And we made decisions. Actually, I made decisions on all of these. The items were all checked to see how many of them had electronic equivalents. We looked for their presence in the guide to reference. We did some other checking. I tried to apply the principles to this sample and project to see what kind of, if we applied certain principles, what percentage of reduction we would achieve. And we did a little bit of tinkering with the principles based upon this particular exercise. And Jeff, I think you're going to take the next section of slides.
Jeff, I can see you're talking, but I don't think we can hear you. If you may need to do the audio setup again, or try muting and unmuting your mic.
I'm not hearing you, Jeff. If you want, I can take the next series of slides. I can hear you in the next room, barely, but I can't hear you on the microphone.
Why don't you go ahead, Bill, and maybe Jeff will get his audio working while you're talking.
Okay, I'll go ahead. I'll go ahead and talk, yeah. This is just a list of some of the candidates that were some of the most likely candidates to move out. This is not a complete list of everything that we moved out, but things like, we had a lot of manuscript catalogs, particularly single author manuscript catalogs, highly specialized filmographies. This was a huge reference collection. A lot of general one-volume encyclopedias, not for specific subject areas, but just, very general works. A lot of business handbooks that really were better in the stacks. Chronologies, which I don't think anyone seems to use anymore. Once it became clear that the renovation plans were going to proceed, and that we had storage space, we began to make plans to, present the plans to the wider group of subject specialists, and we divided the collection among 19 subject specialists who took different areas of call numbers. As the general reference collection manager, I took huge swaths of general collection number, the general collection, general items in the collection. An item list, we generated an item list into Excel of all 53,000 items, and it was distributed to the various subject specialists. And the subject specialists kind of were able to do what they do the project in the way they wanted. I think most of us did go through and look at each item in hand. Some did not. It was kind of up to them and up to their familiarity with the material and with the way they wanted to work. But it certainly was an item by item set of decisions. Although we had the guidelines, although the guidelines did tend to morph a little bit as people worked with this collection, which was fine. We had graduate student assistants who could do things like check for electronic equivalents for the items in the collection. And the subject specialists, either they could submit their decisions on paper to be input, or they could do it electronically to be implemented, we have people designate 4 levels of priority. The most essential items to stay, and items 2 desirable, because we just didn't know really. Even though we tested the principles, we really weren't sure just how it would play out, whether we would have more items that people wanted to stay in reference to that than we had space for. So we developed a system where it would be that the priority 2 items would be the items we would review to see if those could stay if we didn't have sufficient space. 3 are the items everyone thought should leave reference. 4 was kind of a priority to leave. Things that probably should have been sent away earlier, because we didn't at the time. We didn't have the money for the renovation. We weren't sure exactly when it was going to happen. We had a priority 4 just so if we could start moving material gradually, we would have some things to start with. As it turned out, really, we didn't need the distinction between priority 3 and priority 4. Just some examples of things in each priority list. The OED, even though it's electronic, it gets a lot of use in prints. That was kept. Dictionary Alert Biography. We didn't have a full electronic version, which we actually do at this time, so we may actually be moving that out. But some of these others were titles that we thought were essential. Here's some examples of the second priority items. There was a fair amount of, unfortunately, people's different selectors made different interpretations of priority 1 and 2, and in retrospect, that should have been reviewed a little bit more. For consistency. The New York Theater Critics Review probably was a high priority to stay, but that particular selector was very conservative on handing out priority 1s. Here are some examples of priority 3 items. United States Political Science Documents was an old index that is just doesn't get much use anymore, or any use probably, except for one professor who kept referring students to it for years after it had ceased publication. And here are some of the priority 4 items. So things like the Encyclopedia Canadiana, which was a early 50s set. For items that were priority 3 or 4, then subject specialists had to make an additional designation in terms of where they thought it should go, either our remote site, to main stacks, to another collection. There were a handful of items that we put in special collections. Some went to some of our. We do have a couple special reference collections, even though we're highly centralized. There are art reference, music reference. There are a couple other special reference collections. It was assumed that priority 2 items, if they weren't able to remain in reference, would remain in main, if at all possible. We used Dropbox because we're using student assistants who didn't have access to our shared drives that all the staff had access to for the master copies of decisions. We didn't do probably as much collaboration as they did at the University of Chicago. It was basically up to the subject specialists to ask where necessary, to consult where as necessary. And I think most of the subject specialists did where things fell between things where had one set of call numbers, but they may have been interest to other subject areas. And I think, well, this is just a little bit about actually getting the work done. It took about a year. for everyone to do it. So it was a massive amount of time. I reviewed the sheets for the most obvious problems, and we have various disciplinary groups, particularly the humanities group, discussed some of the principles, and there were some adjustments made. So the renovation was finally funded with work beginning in June of 2013. There was really quite a push to get everything done at the end. It was we really didn't have a lot of time. And the decisions are actually people were still making decisions, reviewing the collection up until about a week before, actually less than a week before we had to move the books. So we didn't have a lot of luxury for revising much of this stuff, and that created a lot of inconsistencies that we do have to clean up. And in retrospect, I might have done a little bit more reviewing during the year, but of people's decisions. But man, there was a lot of work to do. In the final days, as the renovation plans, again, the renovation was funded only a few months before it was to take place, so there was quite a push at the end to develop plans. And the plans finally showed that actually we would have room for only about 7,000 volumes and not 15,000 volumes. And this was something that was we learned really only a couple weeks before the items had to be moved. So it was decided to keep only the priority ones on site, move the rest of the collection to the free space that are freed up in our North Campus Library, which is primarily a science and engineering library. And then, because we had all of this information in our spreadsheets, we were able to, someone in our cataloging department, Gary Strawn, was able to write a program to automatically change all the priority 1 items to, well, keep all the priority 1's items in reference. Everything else was given the location in in a special part of our North Campus Library. So the aftermath is, as David said, there is a huge amount of cleanup, probably more here because we really were working against some very, very tight deadlines. We've been selectively bringing back some priority 2 material books into our reference collection. We've been looking at, well, because material out there can be paged to the main collection, or people can go up and check it out. Currently, we are looking at statistics for what has been paged, what has been checked out, helping you using some of those user statistics to help prioritize which of these items can be brought back. We're currently not moving material in the main stacks. There are some other issues affecting our planning up there, particularly our renovation, pending renovation of the Deering building, our older building, which will affect, mean a lot of material will have to be moved from that building into the main stacks. So that is currently on hold, which is unfortunate because it is it does make it hard for users to use those, a little bit harder for use those 45,000 or so volumes that are not in the main building. And I'm just about out of time. Ongoing cleanup. Since the spreadsheets were generated a year before the move, it means that there were items that weren't in the spreadsheets that had newly been added to the reference collection. Dealing with ongoing serials is very complicated. Items that were duplicated in the main stacks and referenced that are no longer high-use reference materials, we are trying to withdraw. We had microfiche and CD-ROMs in the reference collection, and those need a little additional thought. But I thank you, and I think we're open for questions.